Welcome Internet to psychoanalytic cogitation, and today we're going to be talking about guilt and limits and how they play a role for each other. So let me preface this by saying that during my review of Melanie Klein Love, Hate and Reparation, I left out something that was quite important. I didn't leave it out consciously, but unconsciously I didn't talk about it. So I wanted to do it justice here. So just for you to get the idea, it comes from those ideas that I'm going to present are coming from this book, but they're going to be expanded because this is not a review, it's a cogitation, right? Okay, so basically the idea of Melanie Klein puts forward, very interestingly enough, is that children need boundaries, they need limits. They can't be allowed to do everything they want. Because first and foremost, their imagination is limitless, as we all know, and because also there's so much destructivity that it needs to be contained, given shape. And that shape comes from the point of limits, that we limit the child's destructiveness. Then basically that limitation is going to cause a form of guilt, a guilt that's going to be used in reparation, but it's not a bad guilt. For Klein, the problem is if you don't put any form of limits or boundaries, then you're creating the real form of guilt that's going to be so deep that it basically, the child is going to think that he's destroyed the individual, that he's broken them down in a way that's so much more intense than if he just had built that fundamental blocking point in life. And that's a very interesting idea and something that I feel is a bit lost in our contemporary world, where children are to be brought up with the least possible frustrations. And I don't think it's quite right for development. Of course, one should not frustrate the child on purpose. That's just absolutely wrong. But children need to be taught frustration because our lives are built with the dealing of frustrations. Not everything is going to go our way. Even if we have the best of the best case scenarios, the human condition is just built on grief, death, frustration, fear, patience, thriving, working hard, and so on and so forth, and struggling. So the basic assessment that we can outgrow guilt by just preventing frustration is wrong. Frustration is going to come, but with guilt, when boundaries are good enough, the guilt is going to be understandably much more reasonable and be able to be dealt with, because the child will not have that feeling that he can break the others, that the others still remain whole and unaffected by the attacks or are fixable. And that's something that's very important for the child to understand, is that even his aggression, his deepest form of aggression and hate, is not going to destroy others. And that intensity of the unconscious mind is very, very present in children. And one can see that they're virtually driven by their most innate desires, and that they won't have a stopping point if an adult doesn't put that stopping point. And that limit is a godsend for them, because with that limit they can start organizing their mental frames of reference, their mental work and their mental capacities around the limits. I think there is this very interesting idea in art that limitations do not kill work, they make it happen. That through the limitations we discover new ways of doing things. That basically, if the sky is the limit, right, then where do you develop those strategies? Where do you become creative? When does basically the whole position of the mind is at? Because limits and guilt are constructive of the human experience, I feel. Of course, this being said, when I mean all of this, the limits have to be coherent, meaning if they're arbitrary, they're not limits, they're just the law of Talion, which is terrible for anyone to develop under and even to experience as an adult. And there's also this very important fact that the limits have to be explicitly stated. They can't come at another point. They have to be made very clear for the individual. So in this phenomenon where you put the limit, the guilt becomes something of a hope, because the individual realizes that whatever is broken needs reparation, and whatever is fought against will perhaps be affected, but not destroyed. And that's the big key difference. The limit is the moment the individual can build themselves in contrast with the world, and what the world will accept and what it will not accept. And that's also, I think, one of the big and main struggles with, for example, people who have acting out behaviors, because the limit is not clear and the guilt is so extensive when something happens within a relationship of someone that doesn't have limits, or they're going to have even greater acting outs. So I think that it's also something that is very true to clinical understanding, that a limit is not a punishment, it's a guide. And it's a guide both for the personality of the individual, the child, of course, but also adults. And if you cannot make it clear what are your limits and the limits of a setting, the person is going to feel lost. And of course, based on their previous experiences in life, they might be able to get the boundaries very quickly and even have good self-boundaries and self-limits, therefore there's no problems. But some people can be really at a loss, and they might start attacking enormously because the boundaries were not set. Boundaries are so fundamentally important, and I think that in our day and age we tend to lose them. Perhaps it's also how the internet is presented as a limitless, boundless array of possibilities, in the same way that neoliberalism presents itself as basically something that's limitless. But I think that limitedlessness is poisonous to the human mind, because it's not really meant to go that way. It's meant to go in the fact that sins are clear, sins are distinct, and no, not everyone can do any sin, or you can't get access to every sin. And that immediateness of every sin, I think, plays against us. And I don't think it's that surprising that people are getting lost and are starting to go to the most extreme positions, or being completely repressive and destructive, or be trying to become a perfect individual that would frustrate no one, give everyone what they want, not what they need, what they want, and that there would be no form of limits. And in both cases, it's completely wrong. I mean, you can't oppress other people or pressure a child. This is terrible, because it's not limits, it's basically arbitrary violence against the individual and the child. And on the same way, not giving them any limits is fundamentally giving them a handicap in life, because frustration is going to come, and it's going to come fast, and everyone needs to know where they're standing with that frustration. And I think that those ideas that Klein brought up very succinctly in her essay are something that I feel needs to be explicitly made clear, that boundaries and limits are positive because they limit guilt, they limit the feeling of destructiveness, and they give guidance for life and for the frustrations of life. And as such, I find it to be fundamentally positive that everyone has in a way, has a guideline. And if that guideline is too strict or not strict enough, it's going to cause certain forms of issues. And here I'm not talking about determinism, right? Everyone has their own life, their own choices, yada yada yada, right? So there's no like this equals that, and I really want to make this clear. But I do think that there's an inherent value in limits to limit guilt and to make it something that's dealable with, rather than something that's going to create massive suffering and massive anxiety for the individual later down the line. But anyway, this is my very special take on the fact that limits and guilt are intertwined and they need to come together. Well, I said my take, but I expanded on it, but it's Melanie Klein's take that I've transformed a bit, right? But anyway, interesting, and I think it's food for thought. Anyway, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.